In this tutorial we're going to look at element recycling, and we're specifically going to focus on carbon and nitrogen. The first aim is to describe the processes involved in the carbon cycle and then explain the roles of bacteria involved in the nitrogen cycle. Now in chemistry you may have heard of a law that basically states that all matter is conserved. What this means is that new matter can never be created and old matter can never be destroyed. Well, if that's true, where does all that stuff in the universe come from? Even when humans are busy making babies, if the matter that makes up babies isn't new, where on earth does it come from? Well, the answer lies in a very humbling thought, and this thought links absolutely everything in the universe, whether it's living or non-living. The truth is, everything in this universe is made from stardust. You see, stars, like our sun, are element factories. The intense heat and pressure within a star is enough to forge new, more complex elements from simple ones. This process of smashing elements together, or atoms together to make complex ones, is known as nuclear fusion. And it works a little bit like this. Hydrogen is the simplest element in our universe. It's the smallest atom. And stars will smash hydrogen atoms together to make more complex elements such as helium. And when the hydrogen fuel has run out, stars will smash helium together to make larger, more complex elements. So now you can see from helium we've made beryllium, a metal. And this process keeps on going to make more complex elements. So now we've made carbon. But this process continues to make other elements such as nitrogen and oxygen, and finally iron, which is incredibly heavy and will indicate the end of a star's life cycle. You can learn more about that in the physics tutorial on star life cycles. Now that may be all very well, but how do those elements inside a star get inside us? Well, it starts off with the star dying. So some large stars will explode in huge explosions called supernovas, and when they do this, they scatter the elements they've made across the universe. And if we have a look at these elements, we've got hydrogen, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, just to name a few. But any biochemist will tell you that these elements are the raw ingredients for biological molecules, molecules found inside living things. For example, you stick hydrogen onto oxygen and you make water. Carbohydrates are made from carbon, hydrogen and oxygen, as are fats. And if you throw nitrogen in, then you've got the raw ingredients to make proteins. So all other matter is made from the debris that's left behind when stars explode. But this is a biology lesson, not a physics lesson. And the biological focus here is how these elements get recycled through natural systems. The first system we're going to look at is the carbon cycle. We are referred to as carbon-based life forms. Carbon forms the backbone across which all other elements will attach to make up living organisms. So the carbon cycle details how that carbon shifts from one place or one organism to another through four main processes, one being photosynthesis, 2 being respiration, 3 being decay or decomposition, and 4 being combustion, which is the only man-made process in this list. But cycles don't have a start or an end, so you just have to pick an arbitrary point to begin explaining the carbon cycle. I like to start off with the carbon in the atmosphere. So my cycle begins with carbon locked away in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And one thing that instantly makes this easy to remember is there's only one arrow that takes it away from the atmosphere, and that arrow represents the process of photosynthesis. So trees and plants, green plants, they photosynthesize and take that carbon away from the atmosphere and lock it into specific molecules within their structure. For example, that carbon will now form the carbon in proteins, fats and carbohydrates. Those trees and plants will be munched on by animals, and that's how the carbon gets inside animals. Once again, in the form of proteins, carbohydrates and fats. When living things die, such as trees and plants and animals, or when animals produce waste, bacteria act on that organic matter, breaking it down through the process of decay. But decomposition requires energy, and that energy is derived from the process of respiration. So when bacteria break down stuff, they also respire, and respiration produces carbon dioxide, which then gets released back into the atmosphere. But also, as bacteria break down organic matter, they leave carbon in the soil, which can be absorbed by plants, so that's another way carbon can get inside a plant. Now, just like microorganisms, plants and animals also carry out respiration. So that's another way in which carbon is released into the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide. Please remember that plants carry out photosynthesis and respiration. In some exam answers I've read, I often see students miss out the process of respiration from plants. Sometimes organic matter doesn't get decomposed and instead gets preserved to form fossil fuels. For example, coal is fossilized wood. So fossil fuels are a dense store of carbon, and when we burn them, we release that carbon back into the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide. So combustion is another process. So to recap, photosynthesis is the only process that removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Respiration is the main process that puts it back into the atmosphere. The only man-made process that puts it back into the atmosphere is combustion of fossil fuels. And bacteria and fungi decompose organic matter to put carbon into the soil. I think understanding the carbon cycle is fairly easy, but writing about it can be a little bit more tricky because it's hard to know where to start and what to focus on. Here's my tip to overcome that. Whenever writing sentences to describe the carbon cycle, remember these three questions. Where is the carbon? Where is it moving to? And by what process? So for example, carbon in the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide moves to carbon in plants through the process of photosynthesis. Or carbon in animals gets transferred to the soil when the animals die and decay. Or carbon in animals and plants gets transferred to the atmosphere through the process of respiration. So it's really easy once you get the hang of it. Sometimes describing the carbon cycle or explaining the processes involved in the carbon cycle can be a 6-mark question. So you just need to string together 3 or 4 sentences like that. And that's how you describe the processes involved in the carbon cycle. Now for the more complicated nitrogen cycle. The key to understanding how the nitrogen cycle works is really in understanding the roles of the bacteria involved in the nitrogen cycle. There are 3 main types of bacteria as well as decomposing bacteria. We have nitrogen-fixing bacteria, nitrifying bacteria, and denitrifying bacteria. Now 78% of our atmosphere is actually made of nitrogen. And you may wonder, it's a reasonable question to ask, what on earth is all that nitrogen doing? And that's a reasonable question because for us it's doing nothing. Well, not directly anyway. But nitrogen is an essential component of proteins, and we are 90% protein if you take away our water content. So how does that nitrogen end up in our bodies? Well, mainly we have plants and bacteria to thank for that. The problem is that nitrogen forms a very stable diatomic molecule, N2. And before we can use that nitrogen, we have to really pry it apart, so we can react it with other things such as oxygen to turn it into stuff we can use. Now it takes a lot of energy to pry nitrogen apart. A bolt of lightning can supply that energy. It can literally rip apart nitrogen and oxygen can bond to the nitrogen. So lightning can convert atmospheric nitrogen into nitrates in the soil. Nitrates are compounds which are made of nitrogen and oxygen. And nitrates are another word for mineral salts which plants can use for growth. So once the nitrates are in the soil, they can be absorbed by plants to make proteins. Those plants can then be eaten by animals to get those proteins inside animals. Now when living things die, such as plants and animals, or animals produce waste in the form of urea, decomposing bacteria microbes break down those nitrogen-containing compounds to form another nitrogen-containing compound called ammonia. Now my friend's been complaining ever since they got their cat that they always smell really strong scent of ammonia in their living room because the cat brings in half-eaten mice and hides them behind the sofa. So ammonia is that horrible sort of smell of rotting meat that you may be familiar with. So now I'm going to introduce the first of the 3 bacteria, nitrifying bacteria, these orange dots here. And what they will do is convert ammonia into nitrates in the soil, so once again they can be taken in by plants to form proteins. But nitrogen can enter the soil in a more sophisticated way than that if you look at this section here. In certain plants called legumes, examples of which are clover and pea plants, if you examine their roots, you will see that their roots contain swellings. We call these swellings root nodules, and inside these swellings you'll find lots of nitrogen-fixing bacteria. And what these bacteria do is fix nitrogen with oxygen to produce nitrates. So this method is a bit like an express train fixing atmospheric nitrogen directly into plants. But nitrogen-fixing bacteria are also present in the soil where they'll do exactly the same thing, so they're another contributor to nitrates in the soil. And finally, denitrifying bacteria, this blue bacteria here, they will convert nitrates in the soil back into atmospheric nitrogen, so the cycle can start again. Now this may sound quite complicated and there's a lot to remember, but if you remember 3 specific things, you should be fine. Remember that nitrogen-fixing bacteria, the purple bacteria here found in the root nodules of legumes and in the soil, will convert atmospheric nitrogen into nitrates in the soil and nitrates in plants. Then remember nitrifying bacteria, which is found in the soil, will convert nitrogen in ammonia into nitrates in the soil. But that can only happen if the bacteria decompose the animals and plants first. And finally, remember denitrifying bacteria, which are the blue bacteria in the soil here, convert nitrates in the soil into atmospheric nitrogen. The roles of the bacteria are by far the most important thing to remember in this cycle and are most likely to be the thing you'll be tested on if asked about the nitrogen cycle. I'd also like to point out that there's another example of mutualism in the nitrogen cycle. So the nitrogen-fixing bacteria inside the legumes' root nodules, they will create nitrates for the plants, but in return the plants photosynthesize and provide sugars for the nitrogen-fixing bacteria, as well as a home to live. And that's how you explain the roles of bacteria involved in the nitrogen cycle.